He thought he was a dog. He barked, wagged his tail, chased tennis balls, and slept nestled between two old shepherds. But Luca wasn't a dog. He was a leopard raised by kindness. When danger came to the ones he loved, something ancient roared through his chest, and in that sound, he remembered not what he was, but who he was meant to be. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Early spring in the Smoky Mountains never felt quite like spring. The air clung to winter's last breath, curling around the pines like ghostly fingers. A pale mist hovered over the hills outside of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, while patches of melting frost clung stubbornly to fence posts and gravel roads. A gray light touched the earth but never quite settled, casting everything in a kind of reverent hush. It was in this reluctant morning, where silence still ruled the valleys, that Sam Redford, 62 and stubborn as the land he lived on, wrapped his weathered hands around a chipped ceramic mug and stood on the porch of his solitary ranch. Sam was a tall man with a wiry frame and a gait slightly off from an old knee injury. His skin sun-browned and cracked at the corners of his eyes. His beard had once been the color of chestnut, now dusted heavily with silver, and his steel-gray eyes had the kind of weight that only time and loss could carve. He was a man who had once spoken loudly, laughed easily, but had grown quieter since the death of his wife 3 winters ago, a stillness that matched the mountains around him. Since then, he had lived alone except for the company of his dogs and the morning ritual of coffee and watching the tree line breathe. That morning, something different stirred, just as he took the first sip of bitter black coffee. A sound floated through the air, unnatural in the stillness. It wasn't the bark of his dogs or the usual cry of a jay. It was low, trembling, like grief compressed into a growl. Sam's ears sharpened. He set his mug down on the porch railing, the ceramic clinking gently against wood, and stepped into the frost-bitten field, boots crunching with each step. The growl came again, weaker now, folded into a whimper. He crossed the field and ducked into the edge of the forest, the trees arching above him like cathedral ceilings, until he stumbled into a hollow beneath a cluster of firs. What he found there stopped him cold. A female leopard, unmistakable in her golden coat and obsidian rosettes, lay sprawled on her side, her ribs barely lifting. Blood darkened the earth beneath her belly, thick and still. One shot, clean, just behind the shoulder. Sam's jaw clenched. He had seen this kind of work before. Poachers, cutting through the federal parkland like shadows. He'd warned the rangers it would happen again. Now, here she was, dumped and dying within a breath of his land. But beside her, tucked against her chest, was something that hollowed his chest further. A cub, no bigger than a house cat, no more than a few days old, still damp in places with birth. Its eyes wide and shining with an unknowing panic. It didn't cry, just stared at Sam with the blankness of a creature too new to understand the world collapsing around it. Sam knelt slowly, his hands steady despite the ache in his heart. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, his voice rough but low. "You're not supposed to be alone out here," with a gentleness born of years tending to wounded things, animals, Pipo, himself. He slipped the cub into his flannel jacket. It weighed next to nothing, but he could feel the rapid beat of its heart against his chest like a bird against glass. He stood, giving the mother one last nod of sorrow, and turned toward home. The ranch wasn't much, a weather-beaten house, a red barn that leaned slightly in protest of time, and Fields fenced more by habit than strength, but it was his world. Inside. The wood stove burned low, casting its orange glow across the worn floorboards. Sam placed the cub on a folded wool blanket near the hearth and retrieved a bowl of warm water and an old towel, just as he returned. 3 figures padded softly into the room. First came Hank, a 12-year-old black Labrador with a sagging belly and milky eyes. His coat had dulled over time, but his spirit remained solid, slow, and deeply loyal. Hank had been with Sam since the year his wife, Margaret, had gotten sick, and his loyalty was woven into every creak of the house. Next was Daisy, a sprightly border collie of 7, her fur a splash of black and white like ink on paper. She moved with sharpness and precision, always alert, always watching. Daisy didn't trust easily, not since a thunderstorm had spooked her as a pup and left her wary of sudden things. Last was Moose, the gentle giant, an Australian shepherd mix, massive and soft-eyed, barely 5 years old. His thick russet and cream fur puffed out like a lion's mane, and his bark was rare but thunderous when it came. Moose loved everyone. Instantly, the 3 dogs stopped at the edge of the blanket, their noses twitching. Sam stood behind them. "Arms crossed, let's see what you make of him," he whispered. To his surprise, it was Hank who moved first, with slow, deliberate motion. The old dog stepped forward, sniffed the cub, and began to lick its fur clean of the dried blood. The cub flinched at first, but then curled toward the warmth, its small body pressing into Hank's chest. Moose lay down beside them, tail thudding once against the floor. Daisy remained standing, stiff and watchful, but did not growl. Her ears were pricked, her eyes fixed, but after a few moments, she sat, her gaze softening just a fraction. Sam felt something tighten in his throat, a knot of grief and wonder. He hadn't written in years, not since Margaret died and left behind her leather-bound journal half full. But now, he found himself dusting off a notebook, flipping to a clean page, and pressing pen to paper. March the 23rd. Found something I shouldn't have lived to find. A leopard cub, alive, mother's gone, dogs didn't reject him. I don't know what that means yet, I just know it matters. He looked back at the cub, nestled now between Hank and Moose, its breathing steadier, slower. He whispered, almost to himself, "Luca, that's your name?" And in the soft warmth of firelight, the name seemed to settle around the cub like a second skin. The mornings in Gatlinburg had softened. Winter's grip had finally loosened, leaving behind a damp warmth that crept up the hills like a slow exhale. The ground, once stiff with frost, now gave beneath Sam's boots, and the air smelled of wet bark, pine needles, and the faint sweetness of new grass. Luca, now nearly twice the size he had been just weeks ago, had begun to stretch his long legs across the fields, his movements still clumsy but charged with energy. His golden-spotted coat shimmered in the early light, sleek and wild against the farm's domestic backdrop. Sam Redford had started rising earlier since Luca came into his life. The cub, though Sam had stopped calling him that, not out loud, was growing fast, faster than any pup. Sam sat each morning on the porch with his coffee, the old notebook in his lap. He had filled pages now, not just with Luca's behaviors, but with small thoughts, reflections, and, sometimes, even quiet questions about himself. It didn't take long for Luca to begin mimicking the dogs. He'd watched Hank bark at the mail truck and, the next day, let out a strange rasping sound that startled even himself. When Daisy herded the chickens toward their coop, Luca followed, darting left and right with awkward leaps. The chickens, at first terrified, learned to simply ignore him as they did the others. Luca even tried the game Moose loved, fetching Sam's old tennis balls from the fields. But his paws weren't made for catching. They crushed the balls flat in seconds. Still, he brought them back, tail flicking with joy. It was Moose who first taught him the tail wag. The big shepherd mix would trot around the barn, his tail swinging side to side like a pendulum of happiness. Luca tried, really tried. He'd shift his haunches back and forth, almost like dancing, not quite wagging, but undeniably enthusiastic. Sam watched once from behind the wheel of his truck and chuckled so hard he had to wipe his eyes. News of the leopard, who acted like a dog, spread faster than Sam would have liked. A few neighbors dropped by with excuses, borrowing tools, asking about hay, but all left with stories about the big cat playing with balls and chasing chickens. Word reached the local feed store. Then the high school biology teacher. One Saturday, Sam spotted a van parked outside the front fence, its occupants snapping photos through the wire. He grumbled, but didn't send them away. Among the curious was Dr. Grace Miller, the town's veterinarian. Grace was in her late 30s, tall and lean with a commanding walk, and a voice like polished stone, calm, clear, never rushed. Her chestnut hair was usually tied back in a loose braid, and her face bore the light creases of someone who had smiled often in younger years but hadn't done so much lately. Grace had returned to Gatlinburg after a long stint in Atlanta, where an outbreak at a pet shelter had claimed over 60 animals on her watch. Since then, she had grown cautious, not cold, but careful. She came one afternoon in her green Subaru, stepped out in boots and jeans, clipboard in hand. Sam met her at the gate. "You're here to see Luca," he said flatly. Grace nodded. "I've heard things I didn't think were possible." She was led to the barn, where Luca was busy playing tug with Moose, each holding one end of a rope frayed with tooth marks. Grace stood watching for a long moment, then kneeling carefully. She studied Luca's face, his stance, his strange twitching attempts at wagging. "He's healthy," she said at last, "but he's confused." Sam's brow furrowed. "Confused?" Grace sighed, scribbling something on her pad. "He's not just mimicking behavior, he's identifying. He doesn't understand he's not one of them. That can become dangerous." Sam, for him and for them, Sam didn't answer, instead. He looked at Luca, now flopped in the hay, licking Moose's ear. They don't seem to mind. Grace glanced at him, her tone softer. They wouldn't. They're dogs. They don't care about species. But Luca, he might not know who to become that night. Sam returned to his notebook and wrote without pausing. If identity is just reflection, what happens when a wild thing only sees kindness in the mirror? The next morning brought another visitor, not by car, but on foot. His name was Noah Whitman, 9 years old, with wide-set blue eyes and hair the color of storm clouds. He was thin and pale, often wearing the same green windbreaker even in spring. He was a boy from the neighboring property, just across the woods. Sam knew his parents in passing, quiet folks, weary-faced, but hadn't seen the boy much. Noah didn't speak, not to people, not even to his parents. He had been diagnosed with autism at age 4 and had spent much of his time wandering the property in silence. Hands often curled into his sleeves. Sam found him sitting on the edge of the front field, legs crossed, gaze fixed on Luca. The leopard was lying on his side in the sun, eyes half shut, tail twitching in a dream. The 3 dogs lay nearby, and none seemed to care that the boy was watching. Sam didn't interrupt. He sat on the porch instead, silent. Noah came again the next day, and the next. He never tried to touch Luca, never made a sound. But Sam noticed something small change each visit. The way Noah sat closer. The way Luca, without prompting, would walk past and brush the boy's knee with his flank. The way Noah once smiled, barely noticeable, when Luca batted a pine cone his way, one Tuesday morning, as Sam was cleaning the coop. He heard something he hadn't expected, a laugh, light, breathy, and brief. He turned to see Noah giggling quietly as Luca rolled onto his back and flailed his limbs in the air, tongue lolling, mimicking Moose's favorite play-dead routine. The boy clapped once. Luca perked his ears and did it again. Sam didn't say a word, he just watched. The connection between them wasn't made of language, it was something quieter, deeper. Luca never pressed, Noah never spoke, but they existed in a kind of wordless understanding that seemed to defy both instinct and expectation. In his notebook that night, Sam wrote, "The cub is teaching someone to laugh. And maybe, just maybe, he's teaching me too." The wind shifted in the Smoky Mountains. Spring had ripened into a warm, green summer. But something in the air carried a new scent, older, sharper, less forgiving. The mornings were still filled with birdsong and dew on the grass. But Sam Redford noticed how Luca stood a little longer at the tree line now, eyes narrowed, nostrils flaring, as if the wind whispered in a tongue he hadn't heard since birth. There was a tension in the leopard's shoulders that hadn't been there before, a coiled alertness beneath the playful bounds and panting mimicry. Noah still visited nearly every day, usually arriving before Sam even finished his morning coffee. He no longer sat at the edge of the fence. Now he walked straight into the barn and leaned against Luca's side like it was the most natural thing in the world. The leopard didn't flinch. In fact, Luca often adjusted his position to curl around the boy protectively, his broad tail looping near Noah's legs like a promise. They shared a quiet, rhythmic presence. And though Noah still rarely spoke, his eyes were different now, more open, more anchored. But things began to change. It started the night the storm came in. It was sudden. No warning, no clouds building over the ridge. Just a jolt of wind and the sudden flash of lightning that split the field in two. The dogs barked, Moose first, his voice booming across the hills. Sam ran outside in time to see Luca at the edge of the trees, ears back, body tense, and then, in the thin bolt of a second flash, Sam saw the other shape, a full-grown leopard, not sleek like Luca, but rugged. Older, its coat was darker, the rosettes etched into its hide like scars. The creature stood still, massive and unmoving, just beyond the rise. Luca stepped forward slightly, tail low but not tucked, and let out a sound Sam had never heard before, a bark, sharp and hopeful. It was wrong. It did not belong in the wild, and the leopard across from him knew it. The reply came not as curiosity, but a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the trees like an ancient drumbeat. The wild leopard bared its teeth and took a slow step forward. Luca froze, confusion flickering in his eyes. Moose barked. Daisy darted forward, barking so loudly her voice cracked. Hank, slower now but still sturdy, moved beside Luca. Sam grabbed the flashlight from the porch and sprinted toward the field. The wild leopard stared for another moment. Then, with a snort that sent steam into the air, it turned and vanished back into the woods. Luca didn't move for a long time, even after Sam knelt beside him, even after the dogs relaxed. He remained frozen. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. The storm passed by dawn, but Luca's storm was just beginning. In the days that followed, Luca grew distant. He no longer joined the dogs in their fetch games. He stopped barking at the mail truck. He spent his nights outside, returning in the early morning with dirt in his claws and pine sap clinging to his sides. He climbed trees silently, crouched along high limbs and stared into the forest as if waiting. His eyes, once bright and playful, grew shadowed. Sam didn't know how to fix it. He tried everything, bringing out new toys, cooking meat in the cast-iron pan like he used to, even lying next to Luca in the barn late at night, reading aloud from his old notebook. But Luca's head would remain pressed against the wooden floor, his eyes distant, as if listening for a voice only he could hear. And then came the nightmare. It was a quiet Thursday night. Noah had stayed late, curled against Luca until Sam gently guided him home just after dusk. The dogs had settled into their usual corners. Sam had just begun to doze in his reading chair when a shriek pierced the air, raw, guttural, not quite animal, not quite anything else. Sam ran barefoot into the barn, flashlight swinging in arcs. Luca was tangled in blankets, eyes shut tight, paws slashing at the air, claws tearing into the hay. His mouth was open, teeth bared. But no real sound came, just a choked, throaty rasp. Sam didn't call out. He simply knelt beside him, placed a hand gently on Luca's shoulder. "Wake up, boy," he said softly. "You're safe. You're here." Luca's eyes snapped open for a moment. They were wild, untethered. Then he saw Sam, and his entire body deflated. He curled into himself, a tremble running through his spine. Sam stayed beside him, not speaking, just resting a steady hand on Luca's back until the breathing slowed. The next morning, Noah returned earlier than usual, but something was off. His steps were erratic, his face pale. Sam opened the gate and knew immediately something was wrong. Noah's hands fluttered near his chest. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, the boy crumpled to the ground, arms wrapped tightly around his own torso, his whole body quivering. Sam rushed forward, but Luca was faster. The leopard approached, slowly, carefully. He lowered his head until it touched Noah's. Then, without hesitation, Luca wrapped his body around the boy, his neck draped over Noah's shoulder, his powerful limbs forming a protective arc around him. For the first time since the storm, Luca closed his eyes and rested, and in that still moment, Noah spoke. A single word, whispered through clenched teeth. "Safe." Sam stood frozen. Not because he didn't believe what he had heard, but because the silence that followed was even more powerful. Noah's arms slid forward, his hand resting on Luca's flank. He breathed deep, then again. Stronger this time. "I'm safe." Sam swallowed hard and turned his face to the sky. The wind had changed again, but this time, it didn't bring the call of the mountain. It brought something else. The morning Marley arrived. The fog hung low across the hollows of Gatlinburg like an old quilt left out overnight. Sam Redford stood at the gate of his ranch, arms folded against the morning chill, his boots wet from dew. The air smelled of moss and dust, and in the distance, the cry of a hawk broke the silence. A slow-moving animal trailer pulled up, and the engine groaned to a stop. The door opened, and Grace Miller stepped out. She wore her usual field gear olive jacket, tan canvas pants tucked into worn boots, and a quiet resolve that had only deepened since she'd returned to town. Her eyes, always alert but never unkind, met Sam's. "He's in the back," she said, "bit grumpy this morning." Sam raised an eyebrow, grumpy. Sounds promising. Inside the trailer stood Marley, a leopard past his prime, but far from fragile. His coat, once glossy, now bore a dusty hue, faded with age, scars traced over his ribs and shoulder. souvenirs of cage corners and panic-driven pacing. His eyes, however, were sharp, deep amber, watching everything. Even now, with the weariness of a creature who had been made to survive, not live. Marley had spent most of his life in a roadside zoo in Arkansas, caged behind rusty bars, fed on raw chicken and neglect, after public outcry and intervention. He was transferred to a sanctuary in Virginia, but he never adjusted. He refused to eat when near people, ignored enrichment, and spent hours curled in the corner of his enclosure, tail wrapped tight, eyes distant. Grace had worked with him for 6 months, and now, when she saw Luca's shift, his confusion, his quiet unraveling, she thought of Marley, she thought of a teacher. The unloading was quiet. No snarling, no drama. Marley stepped from the trailer with the patience of a monk, his thick shoulders rolling slowly. Luca stood across the yard, half curious, half cautious. The dogs gave Marley space instinctively. Even Daisy, usually unafraid of anything with 4 legs, backed up a few paces. Luca did what came naturally now. He barked once, twice, then padded forward with the lolling, eager bounce Moose used when he wanted to wrestle. Marley stopped, didn't growl, didn't flinch, just stared. His breath was slow, deliberate. Luca crouched down, wiggled his rear end, and rolled over in the grass, legs flailing in the air. It was the same move that made Noah laugh, that made Buddy, the neighbor's golden retriever, play back. But Marley didn't move. His stare deepened, and then, with one slow blink, he turned and walked away. Luca stood up, visibly confused. Sam, from the porch, sipped his coffee and muttered, "Well, that went about how I figured," over the following days. Marley made no effort to engage. He walked the perimeter of the ranch, moving in slow arcs like a shadow, keeping the edges of the world in place. He slept under the oak tree beyond the barn, where no dogs lingered and the wind brought scents directly from the forest. Luca kept his distance, but he watched. Always watched. One morning, just as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, Luca approached Marley again. No barking this time. He walked quietly, his steps lower to the ground. Marley didn't turn his head, but his ears twitched, acknowledgement enough. Luca sat down beside him. No games, no tail wags, just sat, and for hours. They didn't move. That was the beginning. The next day, Marley showed him how to rub against a tree, marking territory with scent. It wasn't forceful. He didn't nudge Luca or snarl. He simply did it. Slowly, back arched, cheek pressed to bark. Luca watched, then followed clumsily, scraping at the bark with more eagerness than grace. Marley flicked his ear and moved on. Another day. Marley lay on a ridge facing the open valley. He began to growl, not aggressively, but rhythmically, deep, low sounds that pulsed like a drum. Luca crept closer, ears pricked. When Marley finished, he simply looked at the younger leopard. Luca tried, his first attempt choked and awkward, more of a cough than a growl. Marley turned away, unimpressed, but Luca tried again the next day, and the next, and eventually, he found the rhythm. The communication was wordless, but undeniable. Marley didn't correct. He modeled, and Luca, for the first time, began to learn not by mimicry but by memory. Meanwhile, Sam had been working quietly on a project that had taken root in his mind weeks earlier. He cleared the west paddock, restored a section of fencing, and built 2 open enclosures lined with straw and shaded by tall elms above the gate. He carved a sign from old barnwood and painted it himself in rough block letters. Peace Hollow. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Grace helped register it as a private rescue zone, unofficial but respected. Word spread. Soon, a local ranger brought in a disoriented lynx cub found wandering a hiking trail. A family dropped off an old beagle with cataracts, abandoned after his owner passed away. And people started coming, not just to visit, but to heal. It was Noah who gave Peace Hollow its heart. He didn't speak to everyone, not yet, but he spoke to Luca, often, softly. Sam overheard conversations sometimes about colors, about dreams, about a fear of wind that made his chest tighten. Luca would just lie beside him, flicking his tail occasionally, blinking slowly. One afternoon, as Grace checked Marley's leg, he had limped after a long walk. She turned to Sam and said, "You didn't just save one animal, you started a ripple." Sam didn't answer. He didn't have to. At dusk that day, Luca walked to the oak tree where Marley lay. He curled beside the older leopard, their flanks just barely touching. Marley opened one eye, then shut it again. Luca growled. Deep. Even. Marley didn't respond, but his tail flicked once. The first snow came quietly, like a secret shared only with those still enough to listen. By sunrise, the ranch had become a page of silence, frost resting heavy on every branch, the fields blanketed in white. Luca moved through it like a shadow with breath, each paw step leaving a perfect print, each motion unhurried. The other animals at Peace Hollow remained nestled in their dens or corners of the barn, but Luca stayed outside, watching the line where trees met light, where silence met memory. Inside the barn, Daisy stirred early. The black and white border collie had always been the first to rise, at 8 years old. Her speed had slowed, but her vigilance had not. She did a quick patrol along the edge of the chicken coop and then circled the main pasture. It was routine, until it wasn't. From behind the woodpile near the orchard, a low growl sliced through the stillness. Daisy froze, ears forward. A blur of movement darted between the apple trees, and then the unmistakable shape of a bobcat lunged from the shadows. It was lean, muscular, fur dusted in snow, eyes wild with cold and hunger. Daisy barked once, sharp and warning, and then again, louder. Sam, still sipping coffee on the porch, dropped his mug at the sound and ran. But it was Noah, now 11, taller but still soft-voiced, who was closest. He had just stepped from the barn, his gloved hands full of feed. He didn't see the bobcat until it was nearly upon him. Daisy did. The collie sprang between them, her teeth bared, growl deep in her throat. The bobcat struck, claws raking across her shoulder. She yelped, but didn't back down. Her body was low, guarding Noah, who fell to his knees behind her. The bobcat prepared to lunge again, and then Luca arrived. There was no bark, no wag, just a sound, low, guttural, rising from his chest like a song from the bones. It wasn't the sound of a confused cub, nor a mimic's cry. It was a leopard's roar, clear, primal, terrifying. The bobcat turned, confused. Luca moved fast. He didn't leap in blindly, but with calculated power. His muscles moved like coiled wires, his tail stiff with focus, with a single charge. He closed the space between them, reared up, and let out a second roar that echoed into the woods. The bobcat reeled, hissed, then bolted into the trees, disappearing into the frost. Luca didn't chase. He didn't need to. He turned instead to Daisy, who lay bleeding in the snow. She licked at her wound, still breathing hard, but her eyes met Luca's with something between pain and gratitude. Sam reached them moments later, coat half-buttoned, eyes wide. Noah stood frozen. Then he whispered, barely audible, "You're not just like them, but you're ours." Luca stepped closer to Noah and nudged his forehead gently against the boy's chest. It was a gesture not from instinct, but memory, a blend of dog and leopard, of comfort and protection. Dr. Grace Miller arrived within the hour. She had been at a neighboring farm, checking on a sick lamb when Sam called. Her hands moved quickly, bandaging Daisy's shoulder, her breath steady, but even she paused when Luca approached and lay down beside the injured dog, curling his large body protectively around her. Grace stood, gloves bloody, eyes shining. He didn't become one or the other, she murmured. He became both. Later that night, when the wind calmed and the animals slept, Sam sat at his desk by the window. The barn was still lit from within, a golden glow through frosted glass. Noah had fallen asleep beside Luca in the hay, head resting on the leopard's flank. The other dogs slept nearby, forming a quiet, breathing circle. Sam opened the worn leather-bound journal. He flipped past months of notes, sketches of Luca's gait, scraps of dialogue between species, fragments of emotion in ink, and turned to a new page. He wrote slowly, his handwriting tight but sure. December 10th. Luca didn't choose between dog or leopard. He didn't have to. He found the thread that binds both: loyalty, instinct, love. The world wants to separate creatures by shape, by sound, by fear. But Luca reminds us that family doesn't need to be the same species, only the same heart. Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet and reverent, as if the mountain itself understood that something sacred had taken root, something not built by man, but by the wild grace of a creature who never asked where he belonged, only who he loved. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come in the shape of a silent paw step, a tender nudge, or a roar that speaks not of fear but of love. Luca wasn't born to be a bridge between worlds. He became one through grace, compassion, and the mysterious ways that God weaves unlikely families from broken pieces in a world obsessed with labels and differences. Luca showed us what it means to live with a heart wide open, to protect, to trust, and to belong. Even when you don't look like anyone else, maybe like Luca. We all carry a part of ourselves that doesn't fit. Maybe that part was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be the very thing God uses to heal others. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Share it with someone who might need to believe that family is more than blood. Comment below what part of Luca's journey moved you most, and if you believe that God still sends us small miracles disguised as animals. Say Amen in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope and redemption. And may God bless every one of you reading this right now.